Right, we have people starting to come into the room. Thank you everyone for tuning in. We're going to wait a few more minutes for people to come into the room and then we will get started. So I think let's wait 2 more minutes and then we will get started right at 7:05. Sean, if you want to get going and give a little introduction.
Sure. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this webinar regarding the City of Quincy's housing production plan for the next 5 years. My name is Sean Glennon. I'm the city's Community Development Director. I'm joined by Sherry Zoe, who is the city's Housing Programs Manager. And we both work in the city's Department of Housing and Community Development, Planning and Community Development. Presenting this evening is Emma Battaglia, who is a senior housing and land use planner at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, or MAPC. And I'll introduce Emma and MAPC's role in this process in greater detail momentarily. During tonight's webinar, we will talk about what a housing production plan is. We will discuss existing housing conditions, and we will seek your input as Quincy residents for the vision and priorities of this new housing production plan. I should mention that housing production plans have existed since 2008, when the Commonwealth of Massachusetts promulgated HPP regulations, which established a more comprehensive approach to traditional affordable housing strategies. The City of Quincy's first HPP was adopted in 2010, and we have participated in this planning exercise every 5 years since then, and are now in the process of developing our third housing production plan. While we still have work to do in meeting the demand for affordable housing, I would be remiss if I did not take this opportunity to illustrate some of the accomplishments we've achieved under the most recent 5-year HPP, including maintaining and increasing federal funding for housing programs, including those for housing rehab and first-time homebuyer assistance. We have monitored and preserved existing affordable housing units. We have partnered with local community housing development organizations to develop affordable housing. We have utilized affordable housing trust funding for construction and preservation of units. We have supplemented existing tenant rental assistance programs, and we have continued to provide resources to reduce the homeless population. Last but not least, we have also reached the very important accomplishment of meeting the state's 10% threshold for affordable housing, which means that at least 10% of the city's year-round housing units, based on the 2010 census, are dedicated as affordable and appear on the state's subsidized housing inventory. That said, when the 2020 census results are released, this percentage will undoubtedly decrease, as it has each time decennial census figures have been released. And so the timing of this planning exercise is quite fitting. I should also mention that the Department of Planning and Community Development is not operating in a vacuum through this process. We are working with a 10-member advisory committee, which includes Sherry and me, as well as other PCD staff, representatives from local community housing organizations, and representatives from the city's Affordable Housing Trust Committee. The full list of advisory committee members will be shown during tonight's presentation. We're also working in partnership with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, again, MAPC, which is the designated regional planning agency for our area. A technical assistance grant from MAPC will pay for more than 70% of the costs associated with developing this plan. The other 30% will be covered through allocations from the Federal Home Program and from the city's Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which is an account funded through local private developer contributions. That is to say, none of the costs associated with the development of this plan will be borne by Quincy taxpayers. With that, I would like to again introduce Emma Battaglia, who is a senior housing and land use planner at MAPC. Sherry and I have been working with Emma over the past 3 months in developing the scope of this work, and we've really enjoyed working with her. Emma has made positive recommendations to us in terms of advisory committee representation. She has facilitated an introductory conversation with our advisory committee members. And just last week, she moderated a very robust housing production focus group among local housing service providers in our community, which will help inform our plan moving forward. So to wrap up my introductory remarks, thank you again all for attending and participating in this webinar this evening. And I'll now turn it over to Emma to begin the formal presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Sean, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Just a brief walk through our agenda for tonight. We will start out with some polling questions to have everybody sort of introduce themselves and give us a sense of who is in the room tonight. I'll spend hopefully no more than 45 minutes on a presentation covering an overview of the housing production plan and existing conditions data around population, housing stock, and affordability. We'll then get into some visioning and priority polling questions. Then we'll have time for a question and answer period. And then we'll go into next steps for the rest of this project, because we are really only at the beginning right now. This meeting is being recorded, though all meeting attendees are muted with their videos off. And so in order to hear questions from you all, we are asking that you put them in the Q&A box should be at the bottom of your screen. Any simple questions we'll try to answer in real time, but then more complicated or recurring questions we'll hold off for further discussion in the Q&A portion of the forum. I also want to mention that Chinese, specifically Mandarin interpretation, is available at this forum. And so Yan Wu, who is joining us tonight and providing interpretation services, has put some directions for how to access that interpretation in the chat. And there's a separate breakout group for people who are interested in those interpretation services. And if you have any questions related to that, feel free to put that in the chat box and we can address that. So I don't really need to get into these introductions since Sean did such a nice job explaining who we are and why we're here tonight. But Sean and Sherry from the city are our project leads, and they are keeping us informed of all things Quincy and making sure that we are getting in contact with all the right people. My name is Emma Battaglia. I'm a senior housing and land use planner at MAPC, and I'm also joined tonight with Lydia Slocum and with Sasha Perotti, who are helping to facilitate this meeting. This is a list of the members of the advisory committee in alphabetical order by first name. We have Beth Ann Strollo, who is joining us from QCAP, Chuck Phelan, who is the Ward 5 City Councilor, Deborah Cabral, who works for the City of Quincy in the Planning and Community Development Department, Donna Ackerman, who works for NeighborWorks Housing Solutions, Joe King from the Planning Department in the City of Quincy, Reverend Sheldon Bennett, Rob Stevens, who also is with the City of Quincy, Sean Glennon from the City of Quincy, Sherry Zoe from the City of Quincy, and lastly, Tom Fabrizio from the City of Quincy. And I want to mention that Councilor Phelan, Donna Ackerman, Reverend Sheldon Bennett, and Tom Fabrizio are all members of the Affordable Housing Trust Committee. And as Sean mentioned, that is partly funding this project and in general is responsible for the preservation and creation of affordable housing units in Quincy. So we'll get into some polling exercises now to give us an idea of who is in the room. We're doing this to make sure that participants in this planning process reflect Quincy's population as a whole, but please know that all answers are optional, so only answer if you feel comfortable. So I will pull up the polling now. The first question asks, how would you describe your living situation? Number 1, you rent your home. Number 2, you own your home. Or 3, other. So I have just launched that poll, and so take a minute or two to put your answers in, and then we will share the results. All right, just a few more seconds. Okay. So here are the results. Over half of the people here tonight own their home. Just over a third rent their home, and a few people have a different situation. Our next question asks, what kind of housing do you live in? The options are single family home, 2-family home or duplex, 3-family home or triplex, smaller multifamily buildings between 4 to 9 units, larger multifamily buildings with 10 or more units, and then you could put anything else in the other box. You want to just take a few more seconds. Okay. So here are the results. Just over half of the people in the room are, they live in single family homes, and a few people in smaller multifamily buildings, larger multifamily buildings, or in another housing situation. This question is about your age. So option 1 is under 18. Option 2, between 18 and 24. Option 3, between 25 and 34. Option 4, between 35 and 44. Option 5, between 45 and 54. Option 6, between 55 and 64. Option 7, between 65 and 74. Option 8, between 75 and 84. And then lastly, option 9, 85 plus. All right, I'm going to close the poll now and share the results. So we have a nice bell curve here. Nobody under 18, but we have a few people between 18 and 24, 25 and 34, and 35 and 44, with the most people between 45 and 54, and then 55 and 64, with one person from each of the 65 to 74 age brackets and 75 to 84. And we asked this question because, as we'll get into later, different age groups have different housing needs, and we want to make sure that we're thinking about housing through people's lifespans. This next question asks what racial and ethnic identity best describes yourself. So the options here are: number 1, white, non-Hispanic; 2, Black or African American; 3, Latina, Latino, Latinx, or Hispanic; number 4, Asian; 5, Indigenous or Native American; and 6 is other. And again, all these questions are optional. So take a few more seconds. All right. So most of the people in the room, classify themselves as white. We have one person who is Latina, Latino, Latinx, or Hispanic, and 4 people who identify as Asian. All right, so just 2 more questions. This is asking how many people live in your household. Obviously, different household sizes have different needs. So I will start this poll. Number 1, 1 person; 2 people; 3 people; 4 people; or 5 or more. Just take a few more seconds. All right. So we have folks in the room who sort of represent all of these different household sizes with the most people either living alone or living with one other person. All right. And the last question asks, how long have you lived in Quincy? Unfortunately, all my options didn't show up here. So there are more in the poll, which I will read aloud and you can answer. So how long have you lived in Quincy? The first option is 0 to 2 years. Second option is 3 to 10 years. Third option is 11 to 20 years. And the fourth option is 21 plus years. But I also put a category in here that you could put in if you don't live in Quincy, but you work here. And then anybody else can fill in the last number 6, other. All right, take a few more seconds. All right, so the highest percentage of people have lived in Quincy for 21 plus years, but we have representation in all of the other age brackets. A few people who don't live in Quincy, but they work here, and then other. So these are the last of my polling questions for right now. We will now go through a short presentation about the housing production plan. And as I mentioned at the beginning, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. We will answer some of them during the presentation, and we'll go through them at the end of the meeting when we get into the Q&A portion of the night. A housing production plan is a proactive strategy for communities to plan for and guide the development of housing. And we are talking about both market rate housing and affordable housing. The plans help communities understand their housing needs, identify housing goals, and make progress towards achieving them. And as Sean mentioned earlier, this project is an update to the last housing production plan that Quincy undertook with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council in 2016. You may have heard about Chapter 40B. It is a Massachusetts regulation that, in addition to governing the comprehensive permit and various things that relate to affordable housing in Massachusetts, it also defines the housing production plan requirements. And the Chapter 40B statute is meant to encourage municipalities to expand their affordable housing stock. If a municipality is below 10%, then affordable housing and mixed income development can be, sort of approved by local ZBAs, even if it doesn't comply with local zoning and other regulations like wetlands or historic districts. Quincy has just met that 10% target, meaning it has achieved safe harbor under Chapter 40B. And that's a good thing in terms of giving the community local control over its housing process. But as Sean mentioned, even though the city has met 10%, that number could change, and it also is not nearly, as high as what the need exists. So it's still important to plan for housing, both market rate and affordable, because we are, in the midst of a housing crisis. And given that supply is so low and demand is so high, anything that we can do to help increase the supply can help stabilize prices to the degree possible. Housing production plans are required to include the following components. The first piece is a housing needs and demand assessment, which we'll be going through some of the highlights of that data tonight. Then we will set housing goals, analyze development constraints, identify housing development opportunities, and in particular, we're required to identify potential sites for mixed income or affordable housing. We'll set strategies, specifically policies and programs that the city could implement to help achieve its housing goals. And we will also set housing production targets for the creation of new market rate and affordable housing. So the project partners are many, really. Leading this project, obviously, is the city staff from the Planning and Community Development Department, along with MAPC. But we are touching in with that advisory committee on a regular basis to sort of make sure that we are reaching as many people as possible and reflecting the goals of the community. But it's really important for us to hear from the community as a whole. So through our various outreach opportunities, which I'll get into in a moment, we look forward to just hearing from everybody who's here tonight and who is interested in housing and wants to help plan for the future of housing. Then the City Council and the Planning Board are listed here because not only are they, a crucial part about implementing any of our housing goals and strategies, they also need to approve this plan in order for it to go on and be an approved housing production plan that we can submit to the Department of Housing and Community Development. MAPC, as Sean mentioned, is the regional planning authority serving the 101 cities and towns in and around Greater Boston. Our focus is on smart growth, equity, and sustainability, and we bring a regional perspective to all of our projects. And as you all know, housing is not defined within any community's borders. We really have to look at it as a regional issue if we're able to make the kind of progress that we want to make in terms of keeping people housed in safe and healthy homes. For this community engagement process, unfortunately, we're still dealing with COVID. And so in order to keep people safe and engage as many people as possible, we are planning for an all virtual process. Though it's really important to us that we are able to engage those who would most benefit from this plan. So, people who have been historically kind of left out of urban planning processes in the past. So that includes renters, people of color, non-English speakers, and other underserved protected classes. And so we hope to engage the community through our digital engagement campaign, which we are currently in the midst of, and I will describe in a little bit more detail on the next slide. We also will be holding a series of focus groups with residents and other community stakeholders. So we just held our first focus group with housing service providers and advocates, and they really gave us some great next steps for groups that we should reach out to and might have really good feedback to offer in terms of how we can set our housing goals. We'll have another round of digital engagement in the spring, late winter, early spring, focused on development constraints, opportunities, and housing strategies. And we'll also, throughout this whole process, be putting together educational materials to let people know sort of why we need more housing and affordable housing in Quincy, and what we're doing to sort of ensure that the people who have grown up in Quincy or who want to live here can afford to do so. So since we can't hold in-person forums, we have come up with this digital engagement campaign approach. So part of that is this webinar, and the webinar is meant to complement the online open house. So I want to plug that because I'm really hoping that you can fill it out if you haven't already, and you could spread the word to your neighbors, friends, and family. It'll go through roughly the same content as this webinar, but there's a lot more opportunities for feedback, for people to be able to provide qualitative, information about their own housing stories and, how they think this plan can best meet the needs of the community. It should only take between 30 and 60 minutes to complete. And, unlike this webinar where you have to sit down from start to finish, you can pause and return to the online open house at any point. It is available in both English and Chinese, and it is open through Monday, January 3rd. So just to show you where we are at with our timeline, we're in the midst of our first engagement campaign, where we are assessing what are the housing needs of the community, what are the community's priorities, and how can we tailor our goals to best meet that. We'll then get into our constraints and opportunities analysis. And when we get to the point when we're starting to come up with strategies for how to meet our goals, we will have another digital engagement campaign so we can get feedback on different housing typologies people are interested in, and again, what policies and priorities they want us to focus on for this plan to get implemented. And then we plan, hopefully by June, to have the plan locally adopted by the City Council and Planning Board. And from there, we will submit it to DHCD for approval. So now I will get into the existing conditions data. And as we go along with this data, I want you to kind of keep these questions in the back of your mind. What data points are surprising to you? How do these data points relate to your housing story and to the housing stories of your family and friends? What stories are not told here? And what issues should this plan address? We're going to be I'm about to throw a lot of sort of quantitative data at you, but it's really important to us that we ground that quantitative data in people's, real life experiences. So hopefully you can all take part in the online open house and, really give us some great feedback in that sense. So Quincy's population is the highest it's ever been, and it's continuing to grow. The city saw an increase of over 10% between the 2010 and 2020 censuses. And compared to context communities that we selected, Quincy has experienced the most growth out of all but Malden. So just to briefly describe how we selected these context communities, we've done this in order to sort of understand how Quincy's housing and demographic data fits in context with other communities, and how it kind of compares in terms of what the housing landscape looks like. And so the project team selected these context communities, chosen based on their similarity to Quincy, but also sort of their usefulness for comparison. This includes communities like Medford that share a lot of traits with Quincy in terms of those, various quantitative characteristics that we compared. And then communities like Somerville, which might be more dissimilar, but are experiencing, even greater housing demand. So what could we potentially learn from them? Racial diversity is continuing to increase. The proportion of residents who identify as non-Hispanic white is down from 67% in 2010 to 54% as of 2020. And residents who are Asian make up almost a third of the population. And that's an increase of almost 50% since the last housing production plan. Since the last housing production plan, we've seen sort of a change in the in the numbers of different age cohorts. And due to rising life expectancy and declining fertility rates, communities across the Commonwealth are aging, and Quincy is no exception. The number of residents in the 65 plus demographic grew the most since the last housing production plan, about 11%, while the number of residents in the 18 to 24 demographic saw the greatest decrease. And like I mentioned earlier, as people age, their housing needs often change, and some households may want to downsize from a large home to a smaller unit. Some might want to live in a dedicated senior community. Others, might want to seek a more accessible home or choose to age in their community. So, we really want to think about the housing needs of all people at various life stages to understand, how we could sort of keep units turning over in terms of seniors being able to find housing that really meets their needs. And so that way we can maybe free up some of those units for families who, are looking to move into a bigger unit in Quincy. A small majority of Quincy's households are renters, and compared to those context communities, Quincy has a lower proportion of rental units than Somerville and Malden, but higher than all of the other context communities. And even though renting is great for its flexibility and its options, it can also be a less stable housing option, and renters often face higher levels of housing insecurity than homeowners because the housing market can change and landlords can decide that they want to raise the rent. So but it's also important to note that being a homeowner or being a renter are not fixed categories, and people really are likely to experience both during their lives. So we want to make sure that we are thinking about kind of all aspects of the life cycle, like I mentioned. A slight majority of households are families. A household is one or more people who occupy the same home. Just over half of Quincy's households are families. And of the non-family population, most are non-seniors living alone, though another third of that group are seniors living alone. So, over 80% of non-family households are folks who are living alone. And same as with tenure or with age, for any given person, their household type will change. And all people, no matter their household type, are welcomed in Quincy, and we want to make sure that the housing stock really reflects the different household types. The prevalence of the prevalence of single family households is likely driving a low average renter household size. This chart compares both owner and renter household sizes across those context communities. And you could see that especially for the renter household size, Quincy's figure is quite a bit lower. And it's likely that, as I mentioned before, that high proportion of single person households, it is probably driving that. Those people are probably most likely living in rental properties, just by how it's sort of affecting that average household size. So now we have a quick poll question asking you, what facts about Quincy's population surprised you? And you can select all that up high. So the first option is that Quincy's population is higher than ever. The second is that racial diversity continues to increase. The third is that since the last HPP, the number of residents 65 plus grew the most, the greatest decrease in residents 18 to 24. Number 4, most Quincy households are renters. Number 5, a slight majority of households are families. And number 6, the prevalence of single person households likely drives a low average renter household size. So I'm going to launch this poll, and you can select as many as you want. So if any of this data surprised you, please check that box. And some of it might not surprise you at all. So interested to see. All right, take a few more seconds. All right. So most people were surprised about the fact that most Quincy households are renters, followed by the change in population among cohorts since the last housing production plan. And then also a few people surprised about how much Quincy's population has increased. So now I will get into some information about the buildings and housing stock in Quincy. So almost 2/3 of Quincy's household consists of buildings with 2 or more units. And as you could see, there's a wide distribution of housing types, and they sort of fall on both ends of the spectrum in terms of people living in detached single family homes, and then people living in some of those larger multifamily properties, that have 20 plus units. And the next most common type is duplexes and small buildings with 3 to 4 units. Most housing in Quincy was built after 1940, after World War II, which is actually different from a number of Massachusetts communities that saw the majority of their housing stock increase before World War II. But this sort of reflects the post-World War II economic boom that brought large increases in housing production and population to the South Shore. And Quincy is no exemption to that. The only context communities that have newer housing stock overall are Framingham and Waltham, whereas over half of all housing units in Malden, Medford, Salem, and Somerville were built in 1939 or earlier. Most housing units in Quincy are not considered family size, which means they contain 3 or more bedrooms. Less than 1/3 of units meet this criterion. And, given the relative lack of larger units, it might be difficult for families with children or multi-generational families and households to find appropriate housing. And so this can also lead to high housing prices for those units that do exist if there's, a real mismatch in the supply and demand for them. This slide looks at housing vacancy. A healthy housing vacancy rate is, if a community has a healthy housing vacancy rate, it means that a household that is seeking housing, whether that's a rental property or a property for ownership, they can easily find it on the open market, but at the same time, those units aren't sitting empty for an unreasonable amount of time. For homeownership units, a healthy vacancy rate is usually between 2% and 3%. And for rental units, a healthy vacancy rate is between 5% and 6%. And as you can see, the chart on the left shows the change in vacancy rate since the last housing production plan. And it really shows that vacancy rates have been well below a healthy rate for some time. And too few available homes basically means that costs will rise. And so compared to some of those context communities, Quincy sort of is on the lower range for vacancy rates for rentals, and especially for homeowner, we really see a very low vacancy rate compared to some of the context communities. Just to define that vacancy rate a little bit more, because you might have noticed the previous slide, which shows the percent of vacant housing units. Vacancy rate is a calculation which includes vacant housing units, but it also assumes that not all vacant units will be rented or sold at any one time. So some landlords may choose to hold on to empty units. All right, so we have another polling question to ask about what facts about Quincy's housing stock surprised you, and you could select all that apply. So the first option is that 2/3 of Quincy's housing stock consists of buildings built before World War II. Sorry, 2/3 of Quincy's housing stock consists of buildings with 2 or more units. The second option is that most housing was built post-World War II. The third option is that most housing units are not considered family size, meaning they contain 3 or more bedrooms. And the fourth option is that vacancy rates are well below healthy rates and are continuing to decrease, signaling a housing shortage. So I've just launched that poll. All right, just take a few more seconds. Okay. So most people were surprised around unit sizes in terms of number of bedrooms and if units are considered family size, followed by a tie in most housing was built post-World War II and the fact around vacancy rates. So the last existing conditions data that we'll cover is around affordability, just reflecting, the huge increase in sale prices since the last housing production plan was produced. The prices for both condos and single family properties have increased more than 50% since 2013. And, this just further pushes home ownership out of reach from the average person who might not be able to afford a large down payment. So this graph shows changes in rents over the pandemic. And, we have seen a slight decline in overall rents since the start of the pandemic. However, they are still much higher than many can afford. And, as we mentioned earlier about, the kind of small supply of larger units and what that might mean for the demand for them and how that affects costs, we sort of saw those prices continuing to rise even as some of the other prices stabilized. But really across all these numbers, they're at a point that a lot of people can't afford to stay in their units. And, if something goes wrong, there's a lot of concern about can I leave and find another option? So that's something we're trying to really look at through this plan. So this graph compares household income between owners and renters, and renter household incomes are typically much lower than owner household incomes. Over a quarter of renters in Quincy have incomes less than $25,000 a year, which is just under the poverty level in Massachusetts. For a family of 4, whereas, over a quarter of owners make more than $150,000 a year. So this sort of gets at that point around renters more likely to experience housing insecurity, because if, there's less cash in the bank to sort of rely on if something happens, that's the more likely that someone may become homeless or might not be able to make their housing payments in a timely manner. This chart shows the breakdown of what's considered low income in the Boston region based on household size. So HUD, the Federal Housing and Urban Development agency, they set a regional area median income, or AMI, which is $120,800 for the whole Boston region. So it's not just Quincy, it's looking at the whole region. And what is considered low income at 80% AMI, it differs depending on if you have a larger or smaller family. So one person household would be low income if they make under $70,000, whereas that number goes up to, around $100,000 for a 4-person household. But beyond just the low income criteria, there's also these sort of deeper levels of affordability that we're trying to look at. So family is considered very low income if they make up to 50% of the AMI, and extremely low income if they make up to 30% of the AMI. And most affordable housing or housing subsidy programs do rely on income status to determine eligibility for assistance. So it's a really important part of housing planning. So a household, this shows the breakdown for households that are owners, renters in total, based on how they fit into those income criteria. And so more than half of all renters in Quincy are considered low income and would qualify for most forms of subsidized housing. And over a quarter of renters are considered extremely low income, meaning they make under 30% of the area median income for the Boston area. At least 40% of all Quincy households, so that includes renters and owners, are cost burden and pay more than they can afford for housing. So a household is cost burdened if they pay more than 30% of their total expenses towards housing, and they're considered severely cost burdened if they pay up to 50% of their income towards housing. And so even though it's really great that Quincy has met that 10% on the SHI, it is really not meeting all the needs of the low income population who already lives in Quincy. So we're not talking about new people who want to come in. This is the existing population who's already here. There's, about 4,200 units on the subsidized housing inventory, but that's still only one affordable housing unit for every low income household in Quincy. And units are considered under this affordable housing umbrella if they are only rented or sold to income eligible households, rented or sold at 30% of the eligible household income. They might have restrictions incorporated into the deed, meaning that it stays with the home, and even if a low income person moves out, that unit would still have to be available for another low income person. And you could have some buildings that are 100% affordable housing. These are typically built by nonprofit organizations, or you might have some affordable housing units in a larger market rate project that's permitted under inclusionary zoning. So we'll do one more quick polling question to just get your take on some of this data around affordability, and then we can move on to a few visioning questions, and then we'll get into the Q&A. So let me pull up this poll. So the first option is median sale prices for both condos and single family homes have increased significantly. The second is around the decline in median rents since the start of the pandemic, but they're still higher than most people can afford. The third, incomes for owner households are typically higher than those for renter households. Number four, a household is defined as low income if it makes less than 80% of the Boston region AMI. Number five, more than half of renters are low income and more than a quarter are extremely low income. Number six, at least 40% of all Quincy households are cost burdened and pay more than they can afford for housing. And number seven, Quincy has one affordable housing unit for every 4 low-income households, despite reaching 10% on the SHI. So take a few more moments. All right. Gonna share the results now. So no one was surprised that incomes for owner households are typically much higher than for renter households. And most people were surprised about the fact that more than half of renters are low income and that the city has one affordable housing unit for every 4 low income folks. All right, so this is a question for you to respond to in the chat. So if you could just take a few moments to let us know what housing issues you are interested in learning more about through this process. And like I mentioned, we'll have another digital engagement campaign coming up with another webinar and another online open house in the spring. We'll also be holding focus groups. And we're also available, for anybody to provide comments at any point. So, I've made my email and Sherry's email available. And so if you have any feedback you want to offer, you're more than welcome to send an email at any time and let us know your thoughts. Oops. Right, I see one thing in the chat about how and where to apply for affordable housing for ownership and rent. And then if you have any other housing issues you're interested in learning more about. We have a response around overall development issues need to be addressed, specifically variance obtained from the zoning board. And I'm going to keep going, but if there's any other housing issues you want to learn more about, please put it in the chat. I'll just add, there's one more about affordable housing for underserved populations and extremely low income individuals and families, and how to solve the problem with the lack of housing stock and affordable housing. All right. So we'll just get into some visioning and priority exercises now. So this is a question that is in the online open house that I've pulled because I think it's a nice question to ask. So imagine your ideal Quincy in the future, and specifically as it relates to housing and affordability, and what words would you use to describe this future? So you could put 5 words, you could put 1 word. Curious to hear your thoughts. And just to make sure we're keeping track of all the questions we get, I'm just not sure if some of the responses are things that people want us to look into in the future or questions that they want to ask now. So if you do have a question that you want to be answered in the Q&A portion, please put it in the Q&A box so we can make sure we're tracking that. Anyone want to offer their ideal version of Quincy in the future? I'll move on, but if you think of anything good, please put in the chat. Okay, so these are not really in any particular order. This just offers up a few options for, strategies and priorities that this plan can tackle. And so of these, we'll go through a few slides which list different options. So if of these priorities, you can let us know through the polling function which you think should be a housing priority, a high priority for this plan. Let me pull this up. So the following priorities are: number 1, housing for new families; number 2, housing for single people; number 3, housing affordable to low income households; number 4, housing affordable to extremely low income households. And number 5, housing affordable to moderate income households. So these are folks that are above that 80% AMI, but you know, we all know how high the cost of housing is here. So, you know, even people who fall into that moderate income bracket are very likely to still struggle with housing costs. So take a few more moments to offer up your high priorities. Okay. So the highest percentage is for housing affordable to low income households, followed by housing affordable to extremely low income households and housing affordable to moderate income households. So the next batch of priorities are as follows. So number 1 is, and so these again, check the box if you think it should be a high priority for this plan. So number 1 is choices for downsizing. Number 2 is support for seniors to stay in their homes. Number 3 is a range of housing types. So, you know, from single family homes all the way to larger multifamily buildings. Number 4, more or better home ownership options. 5, more or better rental options. And 6, more mixed use development. That is retail, commercial on the first floor with housing above. All right, take another moment. All right, so the biggest response here is around range of housing types. So running the gamut, single family, duplexes, small multifamily, larger multifamily, followed by more or better home ownership options and support for seniors to stay in their homes. So here's the last one. Of the following, which would you place as a high priority? So number 1 is housing near amenities like retail, parks, etc. Number 2 is housing near transportation options. Number 3 is housing near jobs. Number 4 is housing accessible to people with disabilities. Number 5, racial and ethnic integration in housing. Number 6, smaller housing options. And number 7, multi-generational housing options. Let's take a few more moments. Okay. So you have the most responses for housing near transportation options, followed by housing near amenities and housing near jobs. All right. So that gets us into our Q&A portion of the evening. So if you haven't already, please write your questions in the Q&A box and the project team will answer as many as we can. So Lydia, if you want to let us know some of those questions, and then the proper folks can respond to them.
Yeah, so I actually think we don't have any open questions. If someone, if there was an answer that we already provided, someone on the team provided, feel free to either re-enter a question, or if anything new has come up, I think we were able to address most. So that was, I guess, a good thing.
I can jump in with one that's
yeah, go ahead,
open.
Sean.
I didn't get a chance to type it in. The Q&A, there's a question about Fox Rock, land disposition agreement. That's not something that Sherry and I would really have the purview to answer. That the land disposition agreement was authorized by the city council, and so I would have to defer to the individuals, either city council or council at large, or potentially the solicitor's office. But that's not something that would have the ability to answer at this time.
Sure. Lydia, do you want to bring up any of the other questions that we can maybe answer again?
Sure. So someone asked, there were a fair amount of questions sort of about, well, what the original question was, you answered right away around HPP and if it's specific to affordable housing. So I think, just reiterating that the HPP is about housing overall. And so hopefully the presentation today kind of underscored that, where, the needs at all ends of income spectrums and all housing types is really the goal of the HPP. There's a couple of questions coming in. We had some, let's see, I think a lot of the questions too, just so folks know, like we also, the chat is tracked. So if it was a question that was also sort of a comment about priorities, we definitely have noted that. So don't worry, even if it got answered, it didn't go away.
I'm seeing a few comments / questions. Sean, I think you could probably answer this best around kind of the development review process and, variances. And so, we're not, a lot of what we're doing here is thinking about, housing very broadly. And, how do we make, how do we codify zoning to have it reflect what we want to see in the community? But Sean, I'm not sure if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, and again, just to reiterate, we're a department of two divisions, planning and community development. So Sherry and I are both on the community development side. The planning board cases are handled by the planning division. And although we don't have a representative of the planning division on this call tonight, I can tell you that planning board cases are heard on a case-by-case basis. And I did see, well, in terms of codification, again, those are adopted by the city council, based on recommendations, usually, from the planning department and sometimes consultants. There was a question too about traffic, which are looked at on a case-by-case basis. If the planning board requests a traffic study for a particular project, then that would be done by an outside consultant at the cost of the developer, and then reviewed by the city's traffic engineer, and then considered by the planning board before a decision is rendered. There was one other question I saw about applying for affordable housing. And I did want to mention that, although the Quincy Housing Authority is a resource, there is a centralized application for the entire state, the CHAMP system. That's the Common Housing Application for Massachusetts Programs. And the site's a little bit long. It's the address rather is public housing application.ocd.state.ma.us. So that the easiest thing is probably just Google CHAMP housing, or Mass CHAMP. Maybe we could put that I could probably put that in the chat, actually.
Yeah, that would be great.
Make it easier for folks. That's, again, because the housing authorities do use a centralized list. That's probably the best way to go. Some housing authorities, and I think Quincy is one of those, where there are preferences for certain types of applicants, seniors, those with disabilities. That's usually the case, but those lists are often closed. They might have a shorter wait list, but there's still a wait list nonetheless. So I would just put that out there. But the CHAMP application is a centralized application that folks would want to put an application for if they're interested in affordable housing.
Great. Sean, are there any other questions that you want to speak about?
Just trying to take a look here to catch up.
I think we can answer the one about context communities. So, the data we chose is across like dozens of different metrics around housing stock, population, demand, affordability. So, we sort of do and we can make this all this methodology available on our website, but we essentially MAPC has a process by which communities are essentially rated based on their similarity across all of these data sets. And so most of the communities we picked are ones that, we've got a really high similarity score, but then as we mentioned, some we did want to pick for their differences because it can kind of show what those differences are and what can we learn based on those differences.
I see one, shouldn't the two departments be integrated? I'm not sure if they're referring to the two divisions of planning and community development, in which case they are integrated. It's one department under the direction of Jim Fatsis. If they're referring to two other departments, I'm not sure what the referral is. Maybe that person could add a little bit more detail. But as far as planning and community development, those departments, the divisions are integrated to one department. And just give me in 1 second, I'm going to post that CHAMP link for folks.
I put it in the chat.
So okay, thank you.
Hopefully it's accessible.
Great. And I just see one comment about, will the slides get mailed to us after? So we will post everything on our website, which is mapc.ma/housing-Quincy. Lydia, if you could put that in the chat.
Yeah.
And but we will also send along a follow-up email after this, in a couple days after this forum, where we include a recording of the presentation and also the slides themselves for any folks who want to hear more about what we talked about but couldn't attend.
So no more questions are coming in. So I know we don't have a huge group, so hopefully that means folks either got their questions answered or Sasha, do you have anything?
Yeah, I'm just seeing one question that came in via the chat around how many of the developers in Quincy are paying a livable wage to build their projects. The person noted that when people are paid well, they can afford to live in the community they work in.
Yeah, I am not sure if the planning board, requires union work. I don't think that's something that the planning board has the authority to do. That would be up to the developer to hire their project team. That individual would have to reach out to the developer to ask them that question, if there's a particular one that they're asking about.
We will do some engagement with developers to sort of understand what their market constraints are, and how can we change the equation to encourage more affordable housing. So that's definitely a good thing for us to ask and to bring up during those conversations.
And then just to address Susan's question here, it is true that the city does not have a master plan, but there are, I know the representatives from the advisory committee attending tonight. Just because folks aren't participating on screen doesn't mean they're not, attending and taking this information into consideration. And as it's recorded too, folks will be looking at the footage after the fact. All this will be taken into consideration. I know some of the things we'll be looking at too are possible locations for future housing development. And one of the issues we'll be looking at is where they are located. If they're in densely populated areas, that's something to consider. If there are areas that be more accessible as far as maybe less heavily trafficked areas, then those are things that we could work into the plan. Just to reiterate, that's the whole point of tonight's webinar, is to really seek this initial feedback to see what folks think we should include in the plan. There's no draft plan tonight to start talking about things we've come up with. This is really the purpose of tonight, is to gather that initial feedback, and then as the plan develops, to be able to share that with the public and receive additional feedback.
Great. Well, unless people have more questions, I think this is a good segue into just plugging the online open house. I've mentioned this a lot, and we're really glad you could all join us tonight to kind of preview this data and ask your questions, but we're really hoping that you can complete the online open house or tell your friends and neighbors about it, because that's really where there are the best options for providing that qualitative feedback. And we're hoping to get a good rate of completion on that. So we encourage you to take it in English or Chinese, and we'll have that open through Monday, January 3rd, and potentially longer, if it seems like people are not really hearing about it over the holidays. We'll continue sort of doing outreach around that, and making sure that everybody who wants to take it has the time. But again, that you could do that at your own pace, and it includes roughly the same content as this webinar, but it goes a little bit more in depth into some of the questions that it asks, and asks for more feedback than we've had the time to do during this event. So like we mentioned, we're still at the very beginning of this process, really kind of getting into the data and trying to get that information out there so the public can react to it. Over the next few months, we will complete our housing needs and demand assessment, directly using the insights from our first digital engagement campaign. That is this webinar tonight, and also the online open house, which we're hoping to get a lot of people's participation in. Based on the community's housing priorities and the insights that we glean from the data analysis, we'll draft housing goals. And then we will begin to assess housing development and constraints and opportunities, specifically looking at potential sites for new development and understanding, what barriers there are there. From there, we will collect potential housing strategies, so actionable policies and programs to help achieve goals, and that will be one of the focuses of our next digital engagement campaign. We'll be talking about sites, development types, and also, strategies that could be put in place around preventing displacement, keeping people in their homes. So we're not just talking about new production, we're also talking about preservation of existing affordable housing units, and also even if they're not deed restricted affordable units, it's important that we are also thinking about how are we retaining those naturally occurring affordable housing options that aren't listed on aren't in that 10% that the city has met, but are a really crucial option for people who live in the community and can't afford the really high rents. So we hope that you will stay in touch with us throughout this process. Here is the project website that I mentioned, mapc.ma/housing-Quincy. And then at this link, mapc.ma/housing-Quincy-email, you could sign up for email updates to find out about our other engagement opportunities. So we'll probably be doing quite a bit of outreach once we get into the winter and spring to hear more from folks about what they want to see through this process. So we hope you will stay involved. And I'll just mention that I'm going to put my email in the chat. If you have questions, please reach out to me or Sean did most of the talking tonight. You could reach out to Sean or to Sherry with the city of Quincy, and they will be happy to record your feedback. Do you want to just put your emails in the chat, Sean?
Yeah. Yep.
Great. So we will make this recording and the presentation available on the Housing Quincy website, and we'll also send a follow-up email to everybody who attended this meeting tonight with the record of the meeting as well. So thank you so much again for joining us and for your participation in this process.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Thanks.
Thanks.